It began in the early hours of a rain-soaked Roman morning. The great bell of St. Peter's had tolled thrice, calling the College of Cardinals to a session that none had foreseen, and few desired. Inside the synod chamber, beneath the vaulted ceilings where Michelangelo's shadows still seemed to linger, tension wove through the air like incense. The crimson sea of prelates stirred uneasily. Whispers had already spread, Pope Leo XIV intended to invoke a forgotten authority. One that could strip even the most exalted cardinals of their place. For weeks, rumors had gathered like thunderheads. 6 cardinals, long shielded by power and position, now faced judgment. A church weary of scandal, compromise, and whispered corruption was watching. The world was watching. At the heart of this storm stood Cardinal Ferraro. He had once been called the architect of consensus, a man whose influence had shaped conclaves and controlled commissions. But beneath the velvet of tradition, a harder truth lay buried. Ferraro had spent decades weaving alliances that protected not the faithful, but the comfortable. Now, sensing the walls closing in, he rose. Tall, silver-haired, voice honed by years in marble halls, Ferraro faced the pontiff. Cameras flickered in the shadows, beaming this confrontation across continents. Millions would soon witness what unfolded. Holy Father, Ferraro began, each word measured, yet edged with disdain. You are dividing the church. His gaze swept the room, seeking allies. You dismantle her pillars under the banner of reform. You sow fear where there was once unity. Is this the legacy you wish to leave? The chamber stilled. Even the ancient frescoes seemed to lean in. Ferraro stood confident. He believed Pope Leo XIV would retreat. He believed the pontiff's humility was weakness. That this was a man who would bow before the fury of the old guard. But Leo rose. Slowly. Deliberately. He had not worn the grand vestments of ceremony that day. Instead, a simple white cassock, a silver cross worn thin from the touch of countless prayers. His eyes met Ferraro's, not with fire, but with a calm that unnerved. And when he spoke, the words fell like a blade. It is not I who divide the church, Leo said softly. It is truth that divides the comfortable from the faithful. A breathless silence followed, deep, stretching, suffocating. The cardinals shifted. The cameras caught frozen faces. Somewhere, a pen clattered to the floor. In that moment, Ferraro understood, this would not be the battle he had prepared for. The pontiff would not be moved, not by accusation, nor by fear. And as the chamber held its breath, one truth stood unshaken: the cleansing had begun. And no power, however ancient, could halt it. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. If this story already stirs something in you, subscribe now. The storm that had begun with a single sentence now rippled through the ancient veins of the Vatican. For behind Cardinal Ferraro's trembling facade stood not one man, but 6. 6 princes of the Church whose names had become known not for holiness, but for the shadows they cast. They were the reason this synod had been called. Not by consensus. Not by tradition. But by the sovereign authority of Pope Leo XIV. Invoking a power so old, so rarely uttered, that many had thought it consigned to history. Visitatio et Purificatio Collegii Cardinalium. Visitation and purification of the college. The last time it had been wielded, Napoleon walked the earth. Now, in an age of cameras and cynicism, Leo would summon it again. For this was no mere political maneuver. It was a reckoning. At its heart stood Pope Leo XIV himself. Born Robertus Prevost, he had once walked barefoot among the barrios of Manila. A missionary bishop who had laid his hands upon lepers, wept with orphans, heard confessions beneath tin roofs while the rain washed over him. His rise to the papacy had shocked the world, a shepherd among wolves, many said. But humility had never meant weakness. And compassion had never meant blindness. Now he stood in the most perilous moment of his pontificate. For across from him, seated in crimson robes, were the six. Cardinal Ferraro, whose nationalist alliances had long placed politics above the gospel. Cardinal Mazzoni, whose fingers, it was whispered, had traced too many trails through the Vatican bank's darkest ledgers. Cardinal Delacroix, whose open defiance of Leo's moral teachings had stirred confusion among the faithful. Cardinal Ibarra, whose name was bound to seal dossiers of unspeakable cover-ups, long hidden beneath ecclesial immunity. Cardinal Varga, whose connections to political lobbyists had eroded the Church's witness. And Cardinal Nguyen, whose doctrinal innovations danced dangerously close to heresy. For years, they had moved unchallenged. Cloaked in the immunity of rank, protected by an unspoken code of survival. They had watched papacies rise and fall, confident that no one would dare disturb the old order. Until now. For Leo had summoned this emergency synod, not to consult. Not to debate. But to act. Within the apostolic palace, the synod chamber had been prepared. No incense. No choirs. Only the austere silence of a tribunal that had not convened in centuries. The College of Cardinals sat arrayed like an ancient council of kings. The six were there by summons, required, but not honored. And across from them, beneath a simple crucifix, sat Pope Leo XIV. His presence filled the room, not with force, but with conviction. His eyes bore the weariness of one who had prayed through the night. His voice, when it broke the silence, carried the weight of a shepherd who had come to guard his flock, whatever the cost. This moment mattered because the eyes of the world watched, not only through the cameras of the press, but through the eyes of every soul longing to believe that the Church could be more than its scandals. That it could still be purified. That it could still be holy. And Leo, knowing full well the price, had chosen this narrow path. Would you dare take this stand if the world was watching? Would you risk comfort for truth? A tense stillness had settled over the synod chamber. The six cardinals, seated like statues beneath their crimson caps, exchanged fleeting glances. They had gathered themselves after Pope Leo's opening words, but beneath their polished exteriors, the tremor of fear had begun to coil. It was Cardinal Ferraro who spoke first. Of course, it would be him. With practiced grace, he rose. Not hurriedly, but as one accustomed to deference. His voice, when it came, was measured, dipped in a patina of elder statesmanship. Holy Father, he let the words hang, letting his gaze sweep the room, gathering invisible allies. Is this truly about truth, a faint pause, deliberate? Or personal vendettas? There it was. The seed of doubt planted before all. The room seemed to lean in. One could almost hear the breath of the gathered clerics. Was this Pope, this reformer from the margins, now grasping at power in the name of purity? But Leo did not flinch. He had faced this accusation not once, but 1,000 times, in whispered chambers, in veiled letters, in headlines crafted to wound. Now, he answered not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of one who had nothing left to lose but truth itself. When darkness clouds the house of God, he said softly, voice carrying through the chamber without effort, light must be let in. No defense of self. No rebuttal of slander. Only an unwavering return to the higher cause. Ferraro's smile thinned. The blade had not struck as intended. He sank slowly back into his seat. But the assault was not yet over. From across the semicircle, another figure rose, lean, sharp-eyed, with fingers that seemed to curl around unseen ledgers. Cardinal Mazzoni. A man whose influence ran deep through the Vatican's financial arteries. A man whose name was whispered behind closed doors in tones of caution. You risk, Mazzoni began, voice cold as marble, destabilizing centuries of order. No venom, no passion. Only the slow weight of institutional threat, designed to remind the pontiff of the edifice he now endangered. But Leo, again, remained unmoved. He lifted his gaze, first to Mazzoni, then to the room. An order built on silence, he replied, words deliberate, every syllable shaped by a deeper grief, is no order worth preserving. A murmur rippled. A sound too soft to be called dissent, too pointed to be dismissed. Several younger cardinals shifted in their seats. A few faces darkened, others softened, as if the long-ignored burden of complicity had been named aloud. And in that moment, the battle lines were quietly redrawn. The six had come with questions cloaked in diplomacy. But Leo had answered not as a politician, nor even as a pontiff, but as a witness to truth. And now, beneath the vaulted ceilings, the chamber held its breath for what would come next. Would you speak with such clarity if your own power hung in the balance? Would you stand for truth if your place at the table was at stake? Subscribe if you believe such courage is needed now more than ever. If you won't, write below, is the comfort of silence worth more to you than the risk of light? The room, already taut with tension, seemed to constrict further. Invisible hands gripped the very air, thickening it with each breath drawn. Cardinal Delacroix shifted forward in his seat. His crimson sleeves rustled, a flash of motion amid the stillness. Known among the six for his eloquence and calculated defiance, Delacroix had built his influence not through backroom dealings but through public voice. A scholar, a speaker, his words reached beyond marble walls, into the homes of the faithful and the ears of the press. Now, his voice rang clear, sharp-edged with moral indignation. "You are alienating millions, Holy Father," Delacroix declared. "By clinging to outdated moral teachings. The world has changed, yet you force it to kneel to the past." The accusation hung like smoke. For a moment, Leo said nothing. He allowed the words to reverberate through the chamber, allowed the gathered cardinals, and the cameras beyond, to sit with them. Then, he rose once more. Not swiftly. Not theatrically. Simply, as one who bore no weight save the truth itself. When he spoke, his tone had shifted, no longer the gentle cadence of invitation, but the measured steel of conviction. "Truth does not age," Leo said, gaze fixed upon Delacroix. "Only ears grow tired of hearing it." A hush swept through the room, one that Delacroix could not immediately fill. But Leo did not pause. Instead, he stepped forward, hands resting lightly upon the ancient oaken table between them. His voice, softer now, carried a deeper gravity. "I have stood," he began, "in the alleys of Manila, where no camera dared follow. I have held the hands of orphans ravaged by disease the world would rather forget. I have knelt beside women torn from the chains of trafficking, whose eyes had forgotten what light was." He looked out upon the assembly, not accusing, not pleading. Simply bearing witness. "Not once," Leo continued, "did those souls ask me whether doctrine had evolved. They asked if love still had the courage to reach them." A flicker of discomfort passed through several faces. But then another voice rose, rougher, urgent. Cardinal Ibarra. Long silent, now leaning forward, voice edged with frustration. "You are politicizing compassion," he shot across the chamber. "You cloak your own agenda beneath the language of mercy." The word sought to wound, to frame Leo as the very manipulator he stood against. Yet Leo remained unmoved. His gaze held Ibarra's. Not in challenge, but in unwavering clarity. "Compassion without courage," he answered softly, "is complicity." A beat of silence followed, deeper than before. Even the oldest among them could feel it, the center of gravity in the room had shifted. Leo was not defending himself. He was exposing them. Not with accusations, but with truths too stark to refute. And as that truth hung heavy, each man was left to reckon not with the Pope's words, but with his own conscience. Would you stand in that room and speak light into such shadows? Would you risk your name for the sake of souls long abandoned? The chamber was no longer a place of debate. It had become a crucible. The air itself felt scorched, burned by the force of truths long unspoken. The 6 cardinals sat in a fragile silence, their previous postures of authority now thin veils against the rising tide. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others gripped the arms of their chairs, knuckles pale beneath crimson sleeves. And then, Ferraro broke. It was no calculated remark this time. No rehearsed line for the cameras. The mask cracked, and through it surged the raw desperation of a man who sensed the walls closing in. He rose sharply, the chair behind him groaning in protest. His voice, once rich with polished rhetoric, now rang with open fury. "So you are Pope and Judge now," he shouted, eyes flashing. "You will ruin us. You will tear down what centuries have built, leave nothing but ashes in your wake." A gasp rippled through the room. Even among his allies, some faces turned away. Not because they disagreed, but because Ferraro had said aloud what they all feared most. Across the chamber, Pope Leo XIV did not flinch. He remained seated for a long breath. Then, slowly, he rose. There was no grand gesture. No raised hand to silence the room. Only the steady unfolding of a man who had already borne greater weights than these walls could contain. His gaze met Ferraro's. Not with heat, but with an implacable cold fire. A gaze not of rage, but of judgment long deferred. And when he spoke, the words were not thunder. They were iron wrapped in velvet, each syllable ringing with unshakable authority. "I have stood before mothers," Leo said, voice carrying through the chamber as if borne on unseen winds, "whose children were buried by your neglect." The words fell like stones into a dark well. A collective shudder passed through the room. "I have heard the confessions of priests shattered by the corruption you shielded. I have sat with survivors whose voices were drowned beneath your alliances." Now he stepped forward, not toward Ferraro, but toward the center of the assembly. The cameras followed, lenses capturing every flicker of the room's unraveling composure. "You call this ruin?" Leo continued, tone sharpened to a blade's edge. "I call it repentance." There was no retort. No reply. Ferraro's mouth opened, then closed. He sank slowly into his chair, the fight draining from his frame. Around the chamber, the effect was electric. Some cardinals sat frozen, faces blanched beneath their caps. Others wept openly, not with theatrical sorrow, but with the raw ache of men who had known, and done nothing. The studio feed captured it all. Stunned faces. Fingers trembling at rosary beads. Eyes cast down beneath the gaze of a shepherd who had chosen the narrow road. And still, Leo stood. No triumph gleamed in his eyes. Only the weary resolve of one who carried both justice and mercy in trembling hands. The cleansing had begun, not with fanfare, not with vengeance. But with truth, spoken in the face of power, unmoved by its fury. Would you stand in such a storm? Would you speak truth when the cost was the comfort of the mighty? Subscribe if you believe such courage must live again in our time. If you will not, write below, what holds your voice in silence when the light calls it forth? The chamber had grown colder. Not in temperature, but in the strange, unmistakable chill that follows when truth begins stripping the room bare. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cardinals sat fixed in their places, some clutching the polished wood of their armrests, others staring into the distance as if seeking refuge in thought. But Pope Leo XIV remained standing, still as a pillar. His gaze did not waver, nor did his voice falter as he prepared to speak again. He looked directly at Ferraro. Not with scorn. Not with pity. But with the gaze of a man who could no longer afford the luxury of silence. "You confuse loyalty to men," Leo said, voice steady as stone, "with loyalty to Christ." The words cut through the chamber with surgical precision. Across the room, several younger cardinals shifted. The old alliances were weakening, the seams of false unity beginning to tear. Ferraro opened his mouth, then hesitated. His voice, once commanding, now cracked beneath the weight of exposed vanity. And you, he stammered, words faltering under the weight of his own unraveling pride, you think yourself above us all. Leo did not move. He allowed the accusation to linger, to show its hollowness to all who heard it. Then, with the faintest shake of his head, he answered, no. Beneath you all. A pause, soft, deliberate. But beneath does not mean blind. The room held its breath. And then Leo turned. Not away from Ferraro, but to the assembly itself. To every man seated in crimson. To every eye that had watched injustice and done nothing. His voice now rang with quiet force, neither loud nor hurried, but weighted with moral gravity. Why does defending the voiceless, he asked, words falling into the stillness like a bell tolling midnight, disturb you more than protecting power? It was no longer a question meant to be answered. It was an indictment written in the air between them. A silence deeper than any yet filled the room. One by one, some cardinals lowered their eyes. The once proud defenders of status and self-interest now faced not a man, but the truth he carried. And that truth showed no mercy for comfort. In the corners of the chamber, the cameras captured it all, hands trembling at ancient rosaries, lips pressed thin to stifle shame, faces once stern now softened by the cold clarity of conscience awakened. Pope Leo XIV stood alone at the center. Not triumphant, not vengeful, but faithful to the vow he had made long ago beneath far simpler roofs, to speak for those whose voices had been silenced by fear, by power, by those who claimed to stand in Christ's name but had long since abandoned his cause. And in that moment, all who watched knew, the old order had begun to fall. Are you ready to defend the voiceless, no matter the cost? The silence that followed was no longer the brittle hush of confrontation, it was the weight of reckoning. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause within those ancient walls. The crimson sea of cardinals, once a portrait of unshaken power, now appeared a gathering of weary men, each faced with the undeniable reflection of his own conscience. Pope Leo XIV stood among them, not with the posture of a victor, but of a shepherd weary from the long road, yet unyielding in his charge. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the sharpened edge that had cut through pretense and pride. What remained was something deeper, gentle, but unbreakable. This, Leo began, words carrying a quiet resonance that seemed to fill every stone and shadow of the chamber, is not about 6 cardinals. He let the truth settle. Not to shame, but to awaken. It is about the kind of church we will leave to our children. A slow breath passed through the room. The weight of generations now pressed upon every shoulder. Leo's gaze lifted, not only to those seated before him, but beyond the walls of the apostolic palace, beyond the cameras, to the countless faithful who watched with trembling hope. The Church, he continued, voice firm with conviction born of long nights and tear-stained prayers, must be a place where wolves fear to tread, he paused. And where lambs rest in peace. The words lingered, an invocation, a warning, a promise. For too long, the Church had been a fortress for the powerful and a labyrinth for the weak. But no more. Not if this man at its helm had anything to say of it. Leo's eyes swept the chamber once more, meeting gaze after gaze. Not to condemn, but to call forth what remained of courage within them. And then he spoke his final line, not loud, not grand, but as a quiet commission for all who would dare to hear, we do not need more defenders of comfort. A pause. We need guardians of the gospel. No one moved. No rebuttal came. For in that moment, every man knew the truth of it, whether they welcomed it or feared it. And beyond the chamber, across screens and sanctuaries, a deeper call was sounded. To choose not the safety of silence, but the bold fidelity of a faith that could once again be trusted. Would you stand among the guardians, or retreat into the comfort of shadows? Subscribe now if your heart knows the answer. And if you will not, write below, what holds you back from stepping into the light? The chamber remained steeped in silence. Not one cardinal stirred, not one voice rose to fill the hollow air left by Pope Leo XIV's final words. Some sat with heads bowed. Not in ritual reverence, but in the first quiet stirrings of reflection, or perhaps regret. Others stared ahead, faces caught between the weight of public shame and the flicker of private conscience. And as the cameras captured this moment, this rare unveiling of raw, human reckoning, the world beyond those walls watched in its own hushed stillness. Yet beneath it all, beneath the crimson robes and ancient stone, a deeper question now whispered. Not only to those in the chamber, but to all who dared to witness, what would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have raised your voice to defend comfort? To shield old structures with words dressed in tradition? Or would you, though your heart might tremble, have stood for truth? Knowing that truth costs. Knowing that truth divides. Knowing that truth heals. In every age, such moments come, when the path of ease diverges from the path of righteousness. And in every age, souls must choose. As this hour's echo fades from the halls of the Vatican, its deeper echo must not fade from within us. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake applause for anointing. Now, the choice is yours. Subscribe to God's Message for Souls, not for stories, but for awakenings. And if you still will not, then do not hide. Comment below, what truth here made you most uncomfortable?